sense. Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in 1932. He was re-elected in 1936, in 1940, and 1944. Now, he was elected 4 times. He only served 12 years because early in his 4th term he died in office. But he got up a policy known as the New Deal. And again, anytime you look in a book and see something in dark print, you might ought to pay attention to it. His New Deal was his idea of fighting depression. And you get into things like in WPA, NRA, NIRA, all these, this legislation designed to fight depression. Some of the New Deal is still around. Among it, Social Security, where that the government, under Roosevelt, the government began taking away part of your pay to make sure you would not be burdened by heavy taxes. So they took out your taxes before you get your paycheck. And your pay was then measured what you get to take home. And they also began to take out Social Security. In other words, the government was forcing you to save money for old age. The plan has worked, folks, for the last 80 or so years. Now, some people say that the young generation do not know a lot, but I think that most of you have probably heard that the Social Security system is on the verge of bankruptcy. Several of you nodding your head, you've heard that. Again, Social Security is largely socialistic. Medicare was the next one, and Medicare would be bankrupt if it were not paid for by the United States. All right. Anyway, but another thing he got to get, Roosevelt got up that's still in the force was the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, where you could put your money into a bank, and if that bank was a member of FDIC, you were guaranteed not to lose your money. Now, it's a great idea, and many a bank has closed, but the FDIC has been able to save them so where nobody has lost a dime who's invested money. But if we really had a supermassive failure, like almost happened to us in 2008, the FDIC is not big enough to bail all the banks out. All right, I'm going to get back to that in just a moment. I must back up to page 688. The man who had the solution to the Depression, John Maynard Keynes. Now, I know that looks like I've spelled it wrong, but actually it's spelled this way, pronounced Keynes. Keynes had the idea that, hey, here's what government should do in time of depression. When a depression hits, government should spend more and lower taxes. Now, if you think that contradicts itself, how do you spend more money if you're a government and lower taxes? Oh, well, he said, you deficit spend. In other words, you borrow money and spend money you don't have. But basically, the lowering of taxes is designed to get money circulating again. Great idea. And the government spending more means the government would do things like build bridges, build roads, build public works, build new schools, and this will put people to work. Here was the idea. Once the Depression is over, then the government can go back to raising taxes and spending less. Now, here's why this is important. Keynes's economics, sometimes called Keynesian economics, has been practiced by the governments of the world for the last 80 years, including Japan and Korea and China and the United States and Britain and France and Germany have been practicing Keynesian economics. Here's the catch to it. When does prosperity return and the government slow down its spending? The answer can be given in just one word. Anybody know? When does the government slow down its spending? The answer is never. They start spending in economically bad times, but when the prosperous times return, the spending keeps on going. Balancing the budget. In my lifetime, our federal government has balanced its budget 3 times. Nixon did it in 1969, and then due to the way the ball bounced in his favor, Bill Clinton was able to balance his budget 2 times during his administration. Governments keep on spending. Well, here's the catch to Keynesian economics. The governments keep spending and keep borrowing and keep going to debt. They set a debt ceiling. When they reach a debt ceiling, they just extend the ceiling. They reach that ceiling and they extend that ceiling. They keep raising the ceiling. The debt doesn't end. And folk, what's going to happen if we don't stop spending more than we take in? If something, we could wind up facing a depression that is worse than anything we have faced, even worse than the Depression of the 30s. In the Depression of the 30s, only, well, 25% of your people who were looking for work were out of work. That's something else, which means that actually half of the country was out of work, but half of the ones out of work gave up looking, so they don't count. Keep in mind, this is something I've had to explain to my daughter, which when you hear these figures, the unemployment rate has gone down. It means either one of two things. Either there's more jobs, so more people are working, or it means a lot of people have just simply given up looking for work and don't look for work anymore. When you quit looking for work, you go off the rolls. If enough people quit looking for work, it makes the unemployment rate look like it's going down, and actually people are giving up. All right, I'll move on. Keynes. Germany, oh yeah, I mentioned Germany. The United States, all right, Russia. Your book goes into more detail about Russia. Essentially, one thing I want to remember, that when the Soviets first took over Russia in 1921, they all of a sudden had 2 really bad years of crop failures, and millions, as many as 5 million people died. Now, if this was not disaster enough, later on under Stalin, millions more would have died, particularly most of them in the Ukraine, which is making news right now. You might wonder why the Ukrainians do not like the Russians. Some of the older Ukrainians remember the starvation that occurred under Stalin. Nobody alive remembers the one that occurred under Lenin. Essentially, for 2 years, Russia suffered greatly. Then, Lenin relaxed his communism and became more capitalistic. And when he did, the Russian economy improved. Again, communism discourages people from working. Under capitalism, he called it his new economic policy, NEP, that was a lot like the old capitalism, but somewhat modified. And your peasants were now allowed to sell their produce on an open market instead of having to be forced to turn all everything they made over the state. Therefore, the peasants had more incentive to work. Hey, if I produce, I'm going to be allowed to sell and make money. I mean, if you have to turn over everything you make to the state, how much incentive do you have to work? Well, now something else I want to mention. I'm looking at the bottom of page 690 about a woman named Alexander Kollontai. Alexander Kollontai. Don't worry about memorizing the name, but there is something I want you to remember about her policy. She was determined to make the women equal. And she got together some policies, and your book doesn't go into all the details I've heard that she did, but among other things, she got a law passed that men and women were equal. Divorce was now made legal. Abortion was allowed. Again, each of you can make up your own mind what you think about these, but these reforms might sound great. What your book doesn't tell you, folk, but I'm going to tell you. The men and women supposedly had free sexual access to each other, whether you were married or not. And it may sound like it was great. In other words, they call it free love. And any man could take any woman out he wanted to, again, whether she's married or not. Marriage had basically almost no meaning. And what happened is in no time flat, the Russian children got to where they didn't even know who their daddy was. Their dads were not required to pay for their upbringing. Whereas if a woman brought a child in the world, it was her responsibility. The dad wasn't around. But something else, the women became utterly psychotic. One person I've heard about talking said they became nervous wrecks, but they began to lose control of their minds. Not to mention venereal disease was just running rampant. And the next premier after Lenin, namely Stalin, Stalin reversed all this. Your book does mention that a lot of these women's rights became undone later because the Soviets ran into other problems and just couldn't pay attention to women. But the fact is, Stalin came along and he outlawed abortion, outlawed adultery, outlawed pornography, and said that deadbeat dads who didn't pay for the children would be jailed. It basically forced dads to pay for the children around the world. What am the point I'm making? The point I'm making is the Soviet Union. All right, we digress. You may have heard of the bullfrog syndrome. You put a frog in the boiling water and he'll hop out. You put a frog in cold water and gradually bring that water into a bowl. The frog won't feel a thing and you'll boil that frog to death if you want. The Russians hopped into the cesspool of immorality, didn't like it and hopped out. We in the West are being boiled alive in the same cesspool. Anyone like that? But we don't even feel it because it's happening to us more slowly. I say they hopped in like the frog in the bowl, they hopped out. We're going through the same thing they went through, except we hardly feel the same on it. You're quiet. I mean, it appears like most of you are listening. I appreciate that. You're awfully quiet. If any of you want to comment, your comments are welcome. Again, maybe you haven't heard this, but again, your book mentions that a lot of men would murder their women who didn't like their wives and daughters to have all this newfound freedom. This was a big problem too they had because the men were used to being in charge. I mean, in the days of Peter the Great, in the marriage ceremony, a whip was bought, and the whip was given to the man, and he said, with this, you're to keep your wife under subjection. Now, it's a whip, literally a whip. Now, it's known still that when the two of them got together, man and woman, strong-willed women still dominated their weak-willed husbands. This was going on down through the ages. But, nevertheless, when all of a sudden these women were liberated, some of the men actually killed their wives and daughters because they said, we can't stand this kind of liberation. This is in the book on page 690.